Chapter 1, Part 1 of Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds by Bernard Lebovier de Fontenelle. Translated by William Gardner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The first evening's conversation, that the earth is a planet which turns on itself and round the sun. One evening after supper, we went to take a turn in the park. The air from the heat of the preceding day was extremely refreshing. The moon was about an hour high, and her lustre between the trees made an agreeable mixture of light and shade. The stars were arrayed in all their glory, and not a cloud appeared throughout the azure sky. I was musing on this awful prospect, but who can think long of the moon or stars in the company of a pretty woman? I am much mistaken if that's a time for contemplation. Well, madam, says I to the Countess, is not the night as pleasant as the day? The day, says she, like a fair beauty is clear and dazzling, but the night, like a brown beauty, more soft and moving. You are generous, madam, replied I, to prefer the brown, you who have all the charms that belong to the fair. But is there anything more beautiful in nature than the day? The heroines of romances are generally fair, and that beauty must be perfect, which has all the advantages of imagination. Tell me not, says she, of perfect beauty. Nothing can be so that is not moving. But since you talk of romances, why do lovers in their songs and elegies address themselves to the night? 'Tis the night, madam, says I, that crowns their joys, and therefore deserves their thanks. But 'tis the night, says she, that hears their complaints, and how comes it to pass the day is so little trusted with their secrets? I confess, madam, says I, the night has somewhat a more melancholy air than the day. We fancy the stars march more silently than the sun, and our thoughts wander with the more liberty, whilst we think all the world at rest but ourselves. Besides, the day is more uniform, we see nothing but the sun, and light in the firmament, whilst the night shews us variety of objects, and gives us 10,000 stars, which inspire us with as many pleasant ideas. She replied, What you say is true. I love the stars. There is somewhat charming in them, and I could almost be angry with the sun for effacing them. And I can't, says I, pardon him, for keeping all those worlds from my sight. What worlds? Says she, looking earnestly upon me. What worlds do you mean? I beg your pardon, madam, says I. You have put me upon my folly, and I begin to rave. What folly? Says she. I discover none. Alas, says I am ashamed, I must own it. I have had a strong fancy that every star is a world. I will not swear that it is true, but must think so, because it is so pleasant to believe it. 'Tis a fancy come into my head which is very diverting. If your folly be so diverting, says the Countess, pray make me sensible of it. Provided the pleasure be so great, I will believe as much of the stars as you would have me. A diversion, madam, says I. 'Tis a diversion I fear you won't relish. 'Tis not like one of Molière's plays. 'Tis a pleasure rather of the fancy than of the judgment. I hope, replied she, you do not think me incapable of it. Teach me your stars, I will shew you the contrary. No, no, replied I, it shall never be said I was talking philosophy at 10 o'clock at night to the most amiable creature in the universe. Find your philosophers somewhere else. But vain were my excuses. Who could resist such charms? I was forced to yield, and yet I knew not where to begin. For to a person who understood nothing of natural philosophy, you must go a great way about to prove that the earth may be a planet, the planets so many earths, and all the stars worlds. However, to give her a general notion of philosophy, at last I resolved on this method. Madam, says I, all philosophy is founded upon these two propositions. 1, that we are too short-sighted, or 2, we are too curious. For if our eyes were better than they are, we should soon see whether the stars were worlds or not. And if on the other side we were less curious, we should not care whether the stars are worlds or not, which I think is much to the same purpose. But the business is, we have a mind to know more than we see. And again, if we could discern well what we do see, it would be so much known to us. But we see things quite otherwise than they are, so that your true philosopher will not believe what he does see, and is always conjecturing at what he doth not, which I think is a life not much to be envied. Upon this I fancy to myself that nature very much resembles an opera, where you stand, you do not see the stage as it really is, but as 'tis placed with advantage, and all the wheels and movements hid to make the representation the more agreeable. Nor do you trouble yourself how or by what means the machines are moved, though certainly an engineer in the pit is affected with what does not touch you. He is pleased with the motion, and is demonstrating to himself on what it depends, and how it comes to pass. This engineer is like a philosopher, though the difficulty be greater on the philosopher's part, the machines of the theatre being nothing so curious as those of nature, which disposes her wheels and springs so out of sight that we have been a long while guessing at the movement of the universe. Let us imagine some of the ancient sages to be at an opera, the Pythagorases, the Platos, the Aristotles, and all the wise men who have made such a noise in the world for these many ages. We will suppose them at the representation of Phaeton, where they see the aspiring youth lifted up by the winds, but do not discover the wires by which he mounts, nor know they anything of what is done behind the scenes. Would you have all these philosophers own themselves to be stark fools, and confess ingenuously they don't know how it comes to pass? No, no, they are not called wise men for nothing, though let me tell you, most of their wisdom depends upon the ignorance of their neighbors. Every man presently gives his opinion, and how improbable soever, there are fools enough of all sorts to believe 'em. One tells you Phaeton is drawn up by a hidden magnetic virtue, no matter where it lies, and perhaps the grave gentleman will take pet if you ask him the question. Another says Phaeton is composed of certain numbers that make him mount, and after all, the philosopher knows no more of those numbers than a sucking child does of algebra. A third tells you Phaeton has a secret love for the top of the theatre, and like a true lover, cannot be at rest out of his mistress's company, with 100 such extravagant fancies that a man must conclude the old sages were very good banterers. But now comes M. Descartes, with some of the moderns, and they tell you Phaeton ascends because a greater weight than he descends, so that now we do not believe a body can move without it is pushed and forced by another body, and as it were drawn by cords, so that nothing can rise or fall but by the means of a counterpoise. To see nature, then, as she really is, one must stand behind the scenes of the opera. I perceive, says the Countess, philosophy is now become very mechanical. Yes, madam, says I, so mechanical that I fear we shall quickly be ashamed of it. They will have the world to be in large what a watch is in small, which is very regular, and depends only upon the just disposing of the several parts of the movement. But pray tell me, madam, had you not formerly a more sublime idea of the universe? Don't you think you then honoured it more than it deserved? For most people have the less esteem for it, since they have pretended to know it. I am not of their opinion, says she. I value it the more, since I know it resembles a watch, and the more plain and easy the whole order of nature seems to be, to me it appears the more admirable. I don't know, says she, who has inspired you with these solid notions, but I am certain there are but few who have them besides yourself. People generally admire what they do not comprehend. They have a veneration for obscurity, and look upon nature as a kind of magic, while they don't understand her, and despise her below legerdemain, when once they are acquainted with her. But I find you, madam, so much better disposed, that I have nothing to do but to draw the curtain and shew you the world. That then which appears farthest from the earth where we reside is called the heavens, that azure firmament where the stars are fastened like so many nails, and are called fixed because they seem to have no other motion than that of their heaven, which carries them with itself from east to west. Between the earth and this great vault, as I may call it, hang at different heights the sun and the moon, with the other 5 stars, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, which we call the planets, not being fastened to the same heaven, and having very unequal motions, have diverse aspects and positions. whereas the fixed stars in respect to one another are always in the same situation. For example, Charles's Wain, which is composed of those 7 stars, has been and ever will be as it now is, though the moon is sometimes nearer to the sun and sometimes farther from it, and so it is with the rest of the planets. Thus things appeared to the old Chaldean shepherds, whose great leisure produced these first observations, which have since been the foundation of astronomy, which science had its birth in Chaldea, as geometry sprung from Egypt, where the inundation of the Nile, confounding the bounds of their fields, occasioned their inventing more exact measures to distinguish every one's land from that of his neighbor. So that astronomy was the daughter of idleness, geometry the daughter of interest, and if we did but examine poetry, we should certainly find her the daughter of love. I am glad, says the lady, I have learnt the genealogy of the sciences, and am convinced I must stick to astronomy. My soul is not mercenary enough for geometry, nor is it tender enough for poetry, but I have as much time to spare as astronomy requires. Besides, we are now in the country, and lead a kind of pastoral life, all which suits best with astronomy. Don't deceive yourself, madam, says I. 'Tis a true shepherd's life to talk of the stars and planets. See if they pass their time so in Astrea. That sort of shepherd's craft, replied she, is too dangerous for me to learn. I love the honest Chaldeans, and you must teach me their rules if you'd have me improve in their science. But let us proceed. When they had ranked the heavens in the manner you tell me, pray, what is the next question? The next, says I, is the disposing the several parts of the universe, which the learned call making a system. But before I expound the first system, I would have you observed, we are all naturally like the madman at Athens, who fancied all the ships that came into the Perennial port belonged to him. Nor is our folly less extravagant. We believe all things in nature designed for our use, and do but ask a philosopher to what purpose there is that prodigious company of fixed stars, when a far less number would perform the service they do us. He answers coldly, they were made to please our sight. Upon this principle they imagined the earth rested in the center of the universe, while all the celestial bodies, which were made for it, took the pains to turn round to give light to it. They placed the moon above the earth, Mercury above the moon, after Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Above all these they set the heaven of fixed stars. The earth was just in the middle of those circles which contain the planets, and the greater the circles were, they were the farther distant from the earth, and by consequence the farthest planets took up the most time in finishing their course, which in effect is true. But why, says the Countess, interrupting me, do you dislike the system? It seems to me very clear and intelligible. However, says I, madam, I will make it plainer, for should I give it you as it came from Ptolemy, its author, or some others who have since studied it, I should fright you, I fancy, instead of diverting you. Since the motions of the planets are not so regular, but that sometimes they go faster, sometimes slower, sometimes are nearer the earth, and sometimes farther from it, the ancients invented I don't know how many orbs or circles, involved one within another, which they thought would salve all objections. This confusion of circles was so great, that at that time when they knew no better, a certain king of Aragon, a great mathematician, but not much troubled with religion, said, that had God consulted him when he made the world, he would have told him how to have framed it better. The saying was very atheistical, and no doubt the instructions he would have given the Almighty was the suppressing those circles with which they had clogged the celestial motions, and the taking away 2 or 3 superfluous heavens, which they placed above the fixed stars. For these philosophers, to explain the motion of the celestial bodies, had above the uppermost heaven, which we see, found another of crystal, to influence and give motion to the inferior heavens. And wherever they heard of another motion, they presently clapped up a crystal heaven, which cost them nothing. But why, says the Countess, must their heaven be of crystal? Would nothing else serve as well? No, no, replied I, nothing so well, for the light was to come through them, and yet they were to be solid. Aristotle would have it so. He had found solidity to be one of their excellencies, and when he had once said it, nobody would be so rude as to question it. But it seems there were comets much higher than the philosophers expected, which as they passed along broke the crystal heavens, and confounded the universe. But to make the best of a bad market, they presently melted down their broken glass, and to Aristotle's confusion, made the heavens fluid. And by the observations of these latter ages, it is now out of doubt that Venus and Mercury turn round the sun, and not round the earth, according to the ancient system, which is now everywhere exploded, and all the authorities not worth a rush. But that which I am going to lay down will salve all, and is so clear that the King of Aragon himself may spare his advice. End of Chapter 1, Part 1.